The Great Homecoming, an historic dramatisation of the events surrounding the First Great Manx Homecoming 60 years ago. Written by Valerie Cottle.
This is an awfully proud moment for me. Proud because in this dominion beyond the seas, I am sitting at the same banqueting table as His Worship, the Mayor of Douglas, Isle of Man. Proud to see what a representative body of Manx men and women look like. Proud because I am one of them, and probably the best looking. And very much proud because at this, the preparation for the First Great Manx Homecoming, I have been asked to propose the toast to that dear love of us all, the Isle of Man.
Yeah. June the 2nd, 1927, and Mr. Hugh Cannell in Montreal proposing the toast of Ellen Vannin before some 320 expatriate Manx men and women set sail on board the White Star liner Albertic for Douglas, 2,615 miles away.
Do you wonder we love our home? And it is to that dear spot, the scenes of your childhood or your parents' childhood, you are going. We who are left behind envy you, but our thoughts will be ever with you. Give our love to Snaith Fell. Think of us when you gaze on the Calf of Man and Cronkney Erie Lay. We will be with you all the way down the magnificent St. Lawrence, across the broad Atlantic. Dear little sea-girt island, may the sun of prosperity ever cast its beneficent beams upon you. Contentment, joy, and peace dwell within your shores, and your future be as bright and fragrant as the springtime gorse upon your hillsides.
Hugh Cannell was by then manager of the Mutual Life Insurance Society of Canada, but he hailed from Port Erin. Amongst the travellers on that first great homecoming were many first-generation Americans who had left the island 20, 30 or 40 years before, but some too who had never seen it, who were the children of Manx parents who had emigrated far back in the 19th century and who knew the island only through family tradition.
Mr. and Mrs. I.H. Brew, Seattle. Mr. Charles Christian, Alberta. Miss F. Kane, Boston. Miss Annie Clegg, Santa Monica. Miss Evelyn Christian, Cleveland. Miss Mona Cragine, Montreal. Miss Lois Kelly, San Francisco. Mrs. R.G. Quiggin, Toronto. Mr. Richard Ratcliffe, Oak Park, Illinois. Mr. R. Skelly, Schumacher, Ontario. Mrs. George Skillicorn, Cleveland. Miss Mary Tier, Cleveland.
The story of Manx emigration goes back hundreds of years. The first recorded emigrants to leave the island for the New World set sail for Barbados in 1646. 36 men and boys set out with high hopes for the plantations of the West Indies, to endure conditions which were little better than slavery. One is recorded 20 years later as having returned to his native land, but the fate of the others is unknown. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the trickle of emigrants built up into a steady stream. Agriculture in the island was in dire straits in the 1820s and 1830s, and whole families uprooted themselves from the land to seek a new life, many of them in America. Some did not even survive the Atlantic crossing, no 5-day cruise in comfort in those days, but an ordeal that could last weeks in horrendous conditions. Some fell by the wayside when they reached their destination, but many thrived and made fortunes and reputations for themselves far beyond the dreams of those who had stayed at home. By the turn of the century, there were thousands of Manx in America. According to the old joke, more in Cleveland, Ohio than were left behind in the Isle of Man.
The Great Homecoming was the brainchild of Arthur Binns Crucall, the Mayor of Douglas, who took a party of 16, including 2 MHKs, Hugo Tier and Ramsay Johnson, George Brown, editor of the Isle of Man Times, and T.R. Radcliffe, editor of the Isle of Man Examiner, to escort the homecomers back to the Isle of Man. The fact that the homecoming could be organised at all was evidence of how tightly knit the Manx communities in Canada and the United States remained. And before they joined the Albertic, the Mayor's party carried out something of a triumphal tour of their own.
They crossed the Atlantic in the westerly direction on board another White Star liner from Liverpool, the Doric, travelling first class, and in true Manx style soon had most of the other passengers singing Ellen Vannin and O Land of Our Birth. Hugo Tier gave T.E. Brown's When Childer Plays and the Peel Lifeboat at a shipboard concert and went down amongst the third-class passengers to give a little talk and a prayer.
They disembarked at Montreal to start a whirlwind tour through Toronto, where a Toronto Manx Society was formed on the spot, to Niagara Falls, where they were welcomed by a Mr. Milcreast from Greba, who told them that Manxmen had been involved in the building of every powerhouse on both the American and Canadian sides of the falls, and to Cleveland, where they were welcomed by 95-year-old Mr. Sheldon Carouche, one of the country's leading lawyers, said to be able to plead a case in 9 languages. He was delighted to see the island party and was able to recite the Lord's Prayer and the national anthem to them in Manx, a feat none of them could have emulated.
The ladies of the party were photographed and interviewed by a Cleveland newspaper as to their views on American fashions, while the men were carried off by a Mr. Tom Tier to visit the Federal Reserve Bank and the Cleveland Savings and Loan Company, of which the president was a Mr. John T. Gill, the vice president, Mr. J. H. Collister, and the treasurer, Mr. Halsey J. Tier. Hugo Tier later recalled the enthusiastic reception they were given at the monthly meeting of the Mona Relief Society.
What a scene of joy it was! Creers and Tears, Kellys and Quails, Christians and Corlets, Kizicks and Quirks, Jochans and Killiers, and hundreds more. Men, women, boys and girls, and such handshaking and almost falling on our necks. Oh, the leck of that meeting has never been seen. No, never been seen. For an hour we chatted and shook hands again and again, and the mayor and our party were taken by storm. The memory of it will live as long as life lasts, to see the boys and girls of 20, 30, and 40 years ago. How beautiful it all was, prophetic of the great homecoming, surely. O land of our birth, O gem of God's earth.
500 of them stood to sing O Land of Our Birth, and the Manx party were cheered again and again. There were solos and selections and recitations and presentations, everything exactly as it would have been at home in the Isle of Man. The next night, 200 American Manx sat down with the island party to a grand banquet, and they sang Ramsey Town and Ellen Vannin all over again.
Ramsey Town, oh Ramsey Town, shining by the sea, here's a health to my true love, wheresoe'er she be.
On Mayor Crucall and his party went to Washington, where the White House was unfortunately closed for repairs, but where a Mr. Kelly of Peel came and had a long talk with them, to Philadelphia, and to New York, where the Isle of Man Times editor George Brown gave a 15-minute talk about the island on NBC Radio.
Benachen voice Ellen Vannin. I suppose it would be just as well if I were to interpret the few words I have just used for the benefit of those few who possibly do not understand. They are Manx, and they mean, in English, greetings from the Isle of Man. Some time ago, a friend of mine was travelling by train, and the only other occupant of the railway carriage was an American gentleman who was doing Europe in the approved manner. In due course of time, these two, the American and the Manxman, got into conversation, and the Manxman regaled the American at great length with a very full description of his homeland, the Isle of Man. The American was very much impressed, and when these two came to part, he thanked the Manxman very heartily indeed for all he had told him about the Isle of Man, saying, "I had no idea of the things you have told me. I was always under the impression that the Isle of Man was a park."
Mr. Brown went on to disabuse his American audience of any remaining idea that the Isle of Man was a park, cramming his allotted 15 minutes with every possible detail of its history and attractions, and concluding,
"I am returning to the Isle of Man in the course of a few days. On board the boat which I am sailing are some hundreds of Manx people. It may surprise you to know, but it is true, that there are more Manx people, by birth and descent, in your great city of Cleveland than what there are in the whole of the Isle of Man today. And some of these people are returning to pay a short visit to their homeland. That is the reason why I have crossed the Atlantic. I have very little more to say, excepting to thank the National Broadcasting Company for the facilities they have given me tonight to talk to you. I hope you have enjoyed my talk as much as I have enjoyed giving it. If I should have awakened in any single person's heart a desire to see my homeland, I will be more than amply repaid. I leave you now. Evi, which in the Manx language means good night.
An overnight train journey from New York back to Montreal, and at last the Manx party went on board the Albertic, flying the Manx flag from its foremast for the great homecoming journey back to Douglas. Homecomers from Los Angeles and San Francisco were on board ahead of them. They hurried back on shore to meet more off a train from Vancouver, the Prairie Provinces and Winnipeg. Then came another trainload from Buffalo and another from Cleveland. The Canadian National Railway, realising that it had a special event on its hands, had arranged for all the passengers to be photographed, and hundreds of Montreal people watched the proceedings with growing interest. At last all were on board, and at 4:35 a.m. the Albertic slipped her moorings and in the early morning sun slid away down the Great St. Lawrence to the sea. The same evening, George Brown was to recall,
At night we held our first community singing, Mr. Axon being on the piano and Mr. Tier conducting half the choir, while the editor of the Times conducted the other half. This created much enjoyment, the cabin passengers entering into the singing with us. We sang all the old songs that will never be forgotten, and in the volume competition, the Times choir of 200 strong easily beat the Keys choir of 200 strong plus 2 conductors and a piano. As night was falling, we made our way indoors and held a sports committee meeting.
That first evening was to set the pattern for the whole voyage. Whist and bridge and children's sports, sacred concerts and fancy dress competitions. At Farther Point off the Gulf of the St. Lawrence, the Albertic stopped to ship her pilot and also a stowaway. 2 more were discovered later in the voyage, but they were pressed into service with the prospect of eventually being handed over to the authorities in England. As the ship sailed on a perfect blue sea, the homecomers exchanged reminiscences, and the editors of the Times and the Examiner ran a whist drive until it was time to go to bed.
The next day was Whit Sunday, and every passenger on the ship gathered in the cabin dining room for the Manx Homecoming church service. All were dressed in their best dark Sunday clothes as if they had been at home, and as they took their seats, they saw that the room was draped with a Manx flag. Then began, said George Brown, a service that for simplicity and reverence could not be equalled, and would never again be seen at sea.
Hugo Tier, we all know him, and many of us love him. But today, as he faced that huge audience, with his eyes sparkling, his voice with a tremble filling the room, we saw in him a new Hugo, as he bade us rise and sing with him the first hymn, O Worship the King.
O worship the King, O glorious above, O great holy, sing his power and his love, a shield and defender, the ancient of days.
How that beautiful hymn filled that room, and filled the whole ship can never be told. The captain and the crew of the Albertic, men who are hardened by the very lives they lead, men from the old world and men from the new, rich and poor alike, the humble Manx homecomer and the American millionaire. Today were indeed one race, one humanity, singing together their praise to the great Almighty. Hugo Tier will fill many parts in this world, but he will never fill a part so well as he did that Whit Sunday.
And dark is his path on the wings of the storm.
By nightfall, they had finally lost sight of the coast of Canada and entered the dangerous ice area.
It is from here for the next 12 hours or more that every moment is full of danger. In the bow of the ship, upon the crow's nest and on the bridge, there were the watchers, while the captain himself was there, refusing to depute his responsibility to anyone. Just off Cape Race, on the port side, we saw the first iceberg, and then during the concert at about 9 p.m, the second appeared on the starboard bow. We could easily see this ocean horror, the sea giving off a sort of phosphorescent light. It was distinguishable for about 8 miles, so that it ceased to be a source of danger. After the concert, we paced the deck, looking for more icebergs. It was cold, bitterly cold, but there was no wind, so that it was not unpleasant. The moon was high in the sky. It was a perfect night to be at sea. With full confidence in the captain and his men, we went to bed, to be called at 5 a.m. next morning to see a veritable shoal of icebergs. They were all around us, some big, real bergs, and others, those miserable little horrors called growlers, which are the most dangerous of all. Some of the bergs were as high as a church with steeples. We shuddered as we passed them, and felt thankful that the captain had taken no risks, but had thought of us and our safety all the time.
On the Monday, the captain of the Albertic amused himself in a race with another liner, the Montcalm, bound for Liverpool. But as they were not due in Douglas until 9 a.m. on the Saturday, there was no point in getting up too much steam. There were sports for the grown-ups in the morning, a horse race in the afternoon, and a monster whist drive and dance in the evening. Looking over the side, the homecomers saw a large whale fast asleep, but it refused to take any notice of them.
In the next 24 hours, the Albertic made 383 miles and was well on course to arrive at her destination on time. The concert that night included a selection of Manx airs by Harry Wood, played by the Albertic's combined orchestras, 2 T.E. Brown recitations by Mrs. Crane of Montana, A Sleep in the Deep by Mr. John B. Kane of California, perhaps dedicated to the whale, and The Manx Wedding by Mr. Tom Christian of Pueblo, Colorado. The Homecoming Male Voice Quartet also contributed some beautiful harmonised songs.
More than halfway across the Atlantic by now, and sailing on a mirror-calm sea, the homecomers staged a mammoth fancy dress parade, with 150 adults and 25 children taking part. Mrs. Corkill of Toronto appeared as the House of Keys, Mrs. Quiggin of Toronto won a prize as a doll, and Mrs. Jackson of Montreal and Mrs. Cool of Buffalo appeared as 2 old Manx ladies. The next day there was another concert, with Mr. Gorry of Peel describing a tea fight, and little Clary Solomons doing recitations, which were quite good.
The Albertic was now approaching Northern Ireland with the mountains of Donegal in view. What were their thoughts? Miss Brew, 80 years old, born in Cleveland of Manx parents, and making the great journey alone at the end of her life, to see the island her mother and father had told her so much about.
Mr. Condon, 74, who'd left Castletown when he was 20, but was still able to entertain his fellow homecomers with racy anecdotes of his early days there.
Thomas Cool, 80, born in Mount Rule and now living in Antioch, Illinois. He had left the island 54 years before and was accompanied on the homecoming by his great friend Mr. W.H. Kelly, formerly of Crosby, and 32 years away from the Isle of Man.
Mr. T.H. Brew, president of the Brew Manufacturing Company of Washington. He'd been born and lived near Lonnon Old Church, left the island in 1876, and ended up as owner of a factory employing 300 people and shipping goods to China, Japan, Australia, and all over Europe.
Thomas Clark, treasurer of the state of Utah, who had left the island 27 years before to work in an American furniture store. After 18 years, he had set up his own furniture business, did very well, sold out, and became city treasurer of Ogden, the second largest town in Utah. He was coming home to stay with his sister at Cross Four Ways.
Mrs. Cool of Buffalo, Miss Kane of Rhode Island, Miss Crane of Minneapolis, Mr. Christian of Michigan, Mr. Quayle of Illinois, Mr. Farger of Los Angeles. They sailed slowly past the Mull of Kintyre on the last leg of their great journey home, and George Brown wrote,
It is a beautiful evening, and some of us are sad indeed that this glorious trip is almost over. Our thoughts are with that great, big-hearted man, Arthur Binns Cruickle, whose wonderful personality has made this great visit a living thing. The homecomers have given him £50 to run a bed in the Jane Crookall maternity home for a year. They pledged that this would be a yearly contribution from the northern continent of America. Mr. Crookall was quite taken aback. He did not expect the gift. He was speechless with emotion and had to be helped from the room with his big heart too full for words.
It was at 4 a.m. on June the 11th, just 7 days since the Albertic had set sail from Montreal, that the Isle of Man was first glimpsed.
The sun had just appeared upon the horizon, and like a ball of fire was lighting up the sea. On the right was Ireland, astern was the Mull of Galloway, and rising out of the blue-grey mist of the sea was the dearest and sweetest little place in the world, Ellenvannin. Aboard the ship Albertic, everything was in readiness. The Manx flag was flying from the mainmast, the royal ensign of the Naval Reserve from the stern. The crew had already washed down ship. Baggage was on deck, and spirits rose in eager anticipation of the landing, which was to be ours in a very short time.
By 5:35 a.m. they were abreast of Peel, heard the siren of trawler sounded in greeting, and answered it with a volley of rockets. Then, for the first time that morning, they heard O Land of Our Birth, sung by a band of homecomers who'd gathered on the forecastle deck. They sailed on right round the Chickens and up past Port St Mary. By 7:40 a.m. they were off Douglas, where they were due at 9 a.m. precisely.
It is 7:40 a.m. We see Douglas and the flags, and we hear the first gun. We see a signal on the Peel Castle as we pass slowly through Douglas Bay. We hear the ships in the pier call to us. We hear the explosions of the guns. The captain gives the order, man stations, as the voyage of the Albertic to Mona's Island with the homecomers comes to an end. Precisely as we promised months and months ago, at 9 a.m. on the 11th of June, 1927.
Since early in the morning, people from all parts of the island had been gathering along the quaysides. The homecomers were not allowed ashore immediately, and by 10 o'clock, literally thousands of well-wishers were lining the promenades as far along as Broadway. Immediate relatives of the homecomers were gathered on the Victoria Pier, along with the official reception committee, a massed choir of ladies led by the Douglas Town Band and conducted by Mr. Noah Moore, and representatives of Manx societies from Australia, Africa and other colonies, as well as those in England. The Peel Castle, which was to act as a tender, went out to the Albertic carrying a message of welcome from the Lieutenant Governor Sir Claude Hill, and finally returned to the Victoria Pier, carrying the first of the homecomers at 11:15 a.m.
She was greeted with O Land of Our Birth, Ramsey Town, Ellenvannin, where dreams come true, and other Manx airs, while there was cheering and waving and calling of greetings from shore to boat and boat to shore. From shore to steamer, thousands of streamers of coloured paper were thrown, till a rainbow of colour seemed to bind the boat to the shore. Then the coming ashore, the handshaking and the calling that was at them, but not for long, because the customs wanted them all examined. And then their luggage passed, and then home, to their different friends and relatives.
There followed 3.5 weeks leading up to Tynwald Day of non-stop social events. It's difficult to believe that some of the older or less resilient homecomers can actually have survived the whirl of garden parties and receptions, concerts and teas, charabanc outings and church services. The little island did them proud, and even those born in the great continent across the water must have been impressed by the warmth of welcome and the beauty of their homeland. There have been many other homecomings since, though today our American cousins no longer make their way here by liner, door to door as it were. There can never have been another quite like that first great homecoming, which gathered up the sons and daughters of man 60 years ago and brought them back to the only place where they really belonged.